What draws people to a degradation kink? And how can something so taboo become so healing? This video is going to unpack the psychology, purpose, and ethical practice of degradation in BDSM, including how it differs from humiliation and objectification. Learn how to engage in these dark arts with intention, consent, and care for both dominants and submissives. I'm Brandon the Dom. Let's dive in. One of my favorite effects of education is its ability to dispel misunderstandings, because misunderstanding breeds fear, hate, judgment, and disgust. If you've watched any of my other material, you know that empowerment is a central part of my MO. So I first shied away from degradation for a long time. I didn't understand it, and I didn't want to engage in something that made people feel less than human. However, there was still an allure to it, a desire that was going unseen and unmet, a desire that had not yet been integrated. And in my experience, you can never fully live in the light until you've integrated the darkness. Remember in Harry Potter how the students are required to study the dark arts, regardless of their moral intentions? Though they're called the dark arts, it's up to the wielder of the tool to decide how it will be used. Degradation is the same. Degradation play can range from mildly embarrassing to deeply shaming, and it is considered a form of edge play, a category of BDSM activities that push emotional and physical boundaries. Because of this, it's important to approach it with a heightened level of communication, trust, and consent, as it can trigger powerful physical and emotional reactions. So let's go ahead and put on your Slytherin robes and dive into the realm of degradation. First, let's talk about degradation versus humiliation versus objectification. One of the reasons that it's often misunderstood is because it's used interchangeably, or often confused with the two closely related kinks of humiliation and objectification. Now, I'm not here to offer a final fixed definition of these terms, but instead to help you understand how they might differ. They're also not mutually exclusive. All of these tend to overlap for some people, and for some people, not at all. So as a quick example, degradation might be coming on a person's face. Humiliation may be having them walk outside with cum on their face, and objectification may be using their face to wipe off your cock as if they were a cum rag. So degradation is the act of reducing the submissive below the dominant in some way, creating a power differential. It's an act that makes the submissive less self-conscious because their attention becomes singularly focused on their purpose, to serve in a lesser subordinated role. We're going to explore this more in a moment, but it's important to note what is being degraded, whether it's worth, honor, strength, character, rank, or status, and have a vastly different effect on the submissive. Humiliation involves causing someone a painful loss of pride, self-respect, or dignity, resulting in shame or embarrassment. This act typically makes the submissive more self-conscious because it engages their self-perception and often makes them confront their fears or shame. It basically plays on our anxiety of how others perceive us and how they respond to us. Objectification is the treatment of the submissive as an object, something that has no autonomy, agency, thoughts, or feelings, and serves a sole purpose of being a tool or instrument to be used. So if degradation is the lessening of the person's human qualities, objectification could be seen as the entire elimination of them. However, this doesn't always mean being treated as a worthless object. Somebody can still be objectified as a highly desirable object, sexually or as a work of art or beauty, yet still have their status as a human being stripped away. So they're objectified. Now, with that understanding, let's talk about the psychology of degradation. Undoubtedly, if you feel confused or resistant to these dark arts, you may be questioning what kind of person would enjoy degrading or being degraded. You might assume that there's something wrong with them, or with you if you enjoy these, for wanting to engage in this type of play. Here, I would disagree. So let's take a look at both sides of the slash. First, why might a submissive want to engage in these types of play? Contrary to what it may look like from the outside, humiliation and degradation is not about breaking the submissive spirit. Instead, they can serve as avenues to profound vulnerability and surrender, seeking liberation in the process. And what they're being liberated from is the grips of shame and guilt from societal roles and expectations, or from the endless cycle of anxiety and self-referencing. This type of play also allows the submissive to feel the power differential between the partners in a more emotionally intense way, which can lead to a deeper state of arousal. There's also a sort of intimacy in knowing that the relationship is strong enough to handle this type of play. Something that I try and teach submissives is that emotions have two components: the somatic experience, which is felt as physical sensations, and then the information or story that we attach to them. Some people enjoy the physical feeling of being embarrassed or afraid because it's similar to the sensations of arousal or excitement. So getting to experience those emotions during humiliation without any real social consequences can actually be a lot of fun. With degradation and objectification, the submissive is offered the opportunity to momentarily shed their societal roles, let go of expectations, and immerse themselves in the present moment. They get to experience that intense feeling of belonging to someone, of being owned even. In objectification especially, the submissive only has one sole purpose: to basically serve as the best damn object that they can. Sometimes that even feels like a compliment in disguise. Being called a good little cocksleeve, for example, can affirm that they're deeply desired sexually. Degradation can also be used as a tool for shame breaking. So imagine that there's a part of you that you're deeply ashamed of. So much so that if anybody ever saw that part of you, you would be instantly rejected. And maybe you feel it's not even one part of you, that it's your whole entire being. Now imagine that you set up a degradation scene where another person plays the role of someone who sees all your flaws and explicitly confronts you with them. And yet, they don't reject you. That's going to run directly counter to your expectations. If they accept all of your flaws, then they are accepting you unconditionally. They're basically saying, even though that you're a dirty little blah, 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 I still love you anyway. And that can create a powerful sense of arousal. And over time, those such scenes can actually be helpful for healing shame. Now let's talk about the flip side. Why might a Dom like to engage in these types of play? Since I'm a Dom, rather than speak in generalities, I'm going to offer one Dom's perspective among many. In BDSM, dominance and submission is what's most alluring to me. And inherent to a DS dynamic, the idea is that the submissive does hold a lower rank or status. However, in my dynamics, that does not mean that the submissive is worth less than the dominant. Both roles are important and complementary. It's basically like a captain and first mate. Both serve a vital position in making the ship run efficiently. The first mate does hold less responsibility and therefore has a lower rank. When it comes to the role that I want to occupy, I'd rather be the one in control, making decisions and accepting the responsibility that comes with that power. This understanding was essential for me when I started to engage in degradation or any adjacent types of play. I needed to explore the feelings behind those acts to discern what I would and wouldn't do. So spending time to get to know your own erotic mind is crucial for this. When I started to engage in this type of play, I discovered that I didn't want to make my partner feel worthless or erode her self-esteem. I did want to reinforce the power differential of the clearly defined roles. And I also knew I was aroused by sexual objectification. So for me, this means that I rarely engage in pure humiliation play, unless it's specifically requested by my submissive in order to help her work through shame, or as a form of punishment. However, I do engage in degradation and objectification. If I'm using degradation, it's most often part of a verbal praise plus degradation plus ownership combo, or it serves as a subtle demonstration and reinforcement of our power exchange. So an example of the praise, degradation, and ownership combo might be something as simple as "You're my beautiful little fuck doll, aren't you?" Here, beautiful is offering praise, little introduces a bit of degradation, and fuck doll objectifies. The inclusion of my reinforces ownership and communicates my desire for her, reminding her that she's not just a thing, but she's this thing for me. She's becoming what I desire her to be, and I see that as deeply personal. And of course, asking it in a question and having her say yes and repeat it back reinforces the dynamic and helps her to drop into that headspace. Of course, any of those elements can be more intensified depending on the language that you're using. For example, if you wanted to get very heavy into degradation, you could say something like, "You're such a good girl for letting me use your princess parts, like a slutty piece of dirty fuck meat." Another way I like to use degradation is as a demonstration of power, almost solely for the purpose of reminding her of the dynamic. But I enjoy subtlety. One of my favorite examples of subtle power in practice comes from ancient Japanese architecture, where the flooring that the emperor sat was raised just one step, maybe like 4 to 6 inches above the floor where everyone else sat. So you just have this subtle demonstration of power. Nobody needs to ask what it meant. All of them just knew. Everyone in the room is still treated with respect, but the authority figure in that room is unmistakable. In BDSM, this might show up as something like remaining clothed while the submissive is naked, or having her kneel on the floor while I'll sit in a chair. Now, BDSM also allows us to create containers, dedicated spaces for experiences that would be harmful or socially ridiculed outside of those boundaries. So, for example, a rage room provides a socially acceptable space for you to engage with the emotion of destructive anger. Doing that in public, though, outside of that room, would have serious consequences. Similarly, the DS container allows the submissive to offer a gift, the gift of allowing you to treat her in a certain way that may explore darker desires that society deems you should be suppressing. It's sort of like a release valve. And when experienced in this safe and consensual container, it can actually transmute that energy into intimacy rather than destruction. This has some similarities to primal play, where you're allowed to unravel those societal expectations and a place to explore you and your partner in a raw, unfiltered power dynamic, free from the usual constraints of language or behavior. Involves a deeper, more instinctual change. And if that's something you're interested in, I'll leave a link down below to the Primal Play video that I created. Now, in objectification especially, there is a sense of freedom of using the submissive in that moment without regards to their feelings. For instance, if I'm face fucking her, there's a moment where I click into a purely taking mindset. She, in that moment, is becoming nothing more than a cock sleeve, used solely for my pleasure. In that small moment, it feels like I get to enjoy the fruits of dominance without the responsibility. Of course, that's an illusion. Every moment leading up to that one, and every moment after, especially in aftercare, or the second that she uses a safe word, I am responsible. And the intensity and beauty of this play rests in that paradox. It's the freedom of release within the container of deep care. Now, let's talk about some other psychology of those using degradation to cause harm. And this is where the sharp line of the dark arts come into play, because your fear about people engaging in this play are not unwarranted. Every type of BDSM play has the potential to cause harm, whether that's self-inflicted or directed at others. And because of the impact of self-perception and emotional states, humiliation, degradation, and objectification are especially vulnerable to being used for manipulative or non-consensual purposes. However, that would not make it BDSM, that would make it abuse. That's why consent, discernment, communication, and risk awareness are absolutely essential when you begin engaging in this type of play. In my view, degradation and its adjacent practices ought to be approached with caution, reserved for partners that have a foundation of solid trust, open communication, and emotional security. And I think that this type of play works better with individuals that have already done some work on inner healing, because hurt people hurt people. So before engaging in degradation, I think it's worth taking the time to look at your intentions. Make sure that you're not wielding this play to serve unconscious or unacknowledged wounds. You should be intentional about creating the desired power dynamic for both of you. So let's talk about some instances when it's not used for great things. First, when it's used in order to erode self-worth. Some people may seek degradation, humiliation, or objectification as a way to reinforce negative beliefs about themselves. In this dynamic, the person that's delivering degradation becomes an external validator for an internalized sense of unworthiness. What they're thinking is, this person says I'm a worthless piece of fuck meat, so I must actually be that. This is why I believe it's crucial to keep degradation play firmly within the context of consensual, conscious BDSM scene, so that the submissive doesn't internalize those messages of worthlessness, shame, or depression. As a dom, if I sense that this is the submissive's underlying motivation to want to engage in this play, I'm not going to participate. In fact, I may go in the opposite direction, affirming their worth, offering words of encouragement, and help them reconnect to their own beauty and humanity. The other way it sometimes gets wrongly used is when it's used to covertly manipulate. So on the other side of the slash, degradation, humiliation, and objectification can be used by the dominant in order to emotionally disarm the submissive, basically lowering their self-esteem to manipulate them into meeting their dom's needs more easily. This is why vetting and understanding the intention behind somebody's darker desires is so important. Just telling somebody that you're into humiliation or degradation is not enough. The why does matter. Now let's talk about when it's used to cope with emotions. So even the most well-intentioned dom can find themselves using degradation play in order to vent frustration, anger, or resentment. For somebody that harbors bitterness or hatred, especially towards the opposite sex, this type of play can become a vehicle for revenge or suppression. That's why I believe it's healthy and even necessary to check yourself before you engage in this play. Ask yourself if you're entering in this scene to consciously create a desired power dynamic, or if you're unconsciously seeking an outlet for unrelated emotions. And then the last thing I want to talk about is when degradation is used in order to build yourself up by tearing somebody else down. So some people, driven by insecurity, may use degradation in order to elevate themselves by lowering the other person. In this case, the Dom is not building power. They're basically building a house of cards. And this behavior is not only harmful to the submissive, it also creates a fragile sense of self for the dominant, one that's inevitably going to crumble when it's actually challenged. So with those things in mind, now let's talk about how to engage in degradation in a fulfilling and safe way. First, let's talk about communication. Open communication, both before and after, is vital for mitigating unintended consequences and make sure that both partners get exactly what they need from the scene. So before the scene, ask questions like, what do you hope to get out of this? What feelings are you seeking? What words are you comfortable hearing or saying? What do you want to avoid? What is going too far for you? And then after the scene, consider some debriefing questions. What did you like or want more of? What didn't work for you or you would prefer we do less of next time? Did anything troubling come up for you? Is there anything else you would like to try? These sorts of conversations can help to uncover insecurities or past experiences that might have been activated. And it can also help bring a greater sense of trust and connection. The second principle to remember here is to remember it's play, not real life. Especially in degradation, it's essential to maintain the distinction between play and real life. The degradation should take place in a clear, consensual container. That container may be just a specific scene, or it may be your entire dynamic, but the boundaries of that container are clear. Because this container allows both parties to fully engage while also keeping that dynamic separate from day-to-day interactions, reducing the risk of unintentionally harming somebody's self-worth. The next principle is that aftercare is absolutely essential for this. If somebody has spent time being torn down, it's essential to invest as much time, if not more, energy in building them up afterwards. Aftercare may include emotional support, physical affection, grounding rituals, or verbal reassurance that you don't actually think of them that way outside of the container. Personally, as a Dom, I also appreciate aftercare in these scenarios. It helps me to hear verbal reassurance that you don't see me as a monster for wanting to engage in these darker dynamics of play. That kind of honesty and mutual reassurance allows both partners to feel seen, safe, and respected. So now that you have a very good understanding of degradation and some key principles to engage in it, let's talk about some ways to engage in degradation play. And before I give you specific examples, it's important to remember what feels degrading or humiliating to one person might actually feel empowering to another. A great example of this is the word slut. For some, it's a cutting insult, but for others, it's a term of endearment or sexual empowerment. Now, I'm just going to give you some categories and examples of things that you can do, but there really is no limit for the types of ways that you might explore. Know you, know your partner, understand what may work for each of you. But the first examples we're going to talk about is verbal degradation. Words obviously have a lot of power, and in degradation play, you might use them to tease, insult or mock, name call, belittle or scold, or question their intelligence, their appearance, or their abilities. You can also involve the submissive's voice in this type of play by having them repeat back degrading phrases, beg for degrading acts, ask permission for basic tasks such as using the bathroom, or have them verbally admit to something shameful or embarrassing, such as, "You're so wet when I do this degrading act to you," and they have to admit how wet they are. The next category is physical degradation. So this can help to communicate a loss of status or a loss of power. And it might include releasing bodily fluids, such as cum, spit, urine, whatever, onto them. You can also consensually force them to perform a sexual act. You can have them remain nude, or assigning them very degrading or humiliating physical tasks. Another type of degradation play is having them do animal role play. So have them role play as an animal or non-human creature that has a lower perceived rank. So this might be something like having them eat out of a bowl and eating without utensils, might be having them crawl or sleep on the floor, or maybe using a pet bed, or having them respond to commands wearing a leash or some sort of tail plug, basically showing them you're nothing more than an animal. you're no longer a human. Another type of play that you can do is body writing. So here you're basically taking verbal degradation, but you're using body safe markers to write on their body. So you can cover them in degrading or humiliating words, or have them write it on themselves, kind of reinforcing that. Or something that I like to do sometimes is to basically flip the script on this and have them write empowering words like beautiful on body parts that they struggle to love. The next thing you can do, which leans more to objectification, is having them serve as objects. So in objectification scenes, the submissive may be used as a furniture or a stool, table, or footrest, or they can also be used as a prized possession, like a piece of artwork that's to be admired and displayed. Because objectification doesn't have to be cruel. For example, I particularly enjoy erotic photography, where the submissive in that moment is becoming a beautiful, curated object, frozen in time as a vision of art. There's also sexual objectification, where the submissive is basically being used purely for the dominant's pleasure, like a living sex toy. Now, not always seen this way, but brat taming can also be a part of degradation play, because degradation can be used as part of a brat dynamic in order to shift the dynamic back into the ranks it's supposed to be, especially if the brat is being cheeky, demanding, or entitled. So basically here you're trying to knock that entitlement down a notch using degradation. That said, do not use degradation as a form of revenge because you're sick of dealing with the brat, and make sure that degradation is a clearly defined part of your brat taming toolkit. Now, brat taming is something you're interested in. I also have a video on that. I'll leave a link down below. And then the last form of degradation play that I want to mention is making them admit that they enjoy something. Now, this one lands a little bit more towards the spectrum of humiliation, where you make them admit that they like something that's embarrassing or taboo, or as I mentioned before, pointing out how wet or aroused they are by something that they shouldn't like. This can be particularly powerful for helping submissives work through shame blocks, helping them to confront their internalized guilt by transforming it into arousal and acceptance. So degradation play, like all forms of edge play, isn't about being mean. It's about being masterful. It requires more than just dirty words or degrading acts, because it demands emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and a deep respect for your partner's boundaries and psyche. The line between harm and healing can be razor thin here, but navigated with consent and care, degradation can become a powerful vehicle for power exchange, liberation, and even alchemy of shame. It's not about taking somebody apart for the fun of it. It's about knowing how to put them back together stronger, sexier, and more surrendered than before. And that is the real dark art. Now, if you're interested in other types of play that are liberating like this, I recommend watching this video on primal play, where you're going to learn to basically have sex like an animal, to click out of that everyday societal persona that you have to put on into something much more instinctual. So check out that video, and thank you so much for your time and attention.